Good evening. I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. We have a very interesting program in store for you. I'm going to do things a little bit differently tonight. I'm going to introduce you to somebody that you know who's going to introduce us to the speaker because he knows him a little better than I do. So I want to introduce you to Bruce Chadbourne, one of our residents here at Cornwall Manor who helps me out a lot. So let's give him a warm round of applause and a thank you.
Okay. I guess you have to swallow this thing. Note to Jim.
I'll turn it off.
Well, I'm glad you're here. I was kind of asked on the spot to introduce Jim, and the quick story would be Linda and I had just been here about 4 years last week, and I think I know almost everyone in the room. So it's kind of fun the way we have this community. One of the things that, other than that attracted me here was when we drove up, we saw all the old buildings and the furnace across the street. A few months after settling in, Jim, well, I said I wanted to volunteer and help, and Jim happened to be quite nearby, and he dragged me into a room and showed me the stack of boxes of old letters and things and said, how would you like to read these and catalog them? And believe it or not, I said, yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. And some of you probably know I've been writing historical articles, and all of that is an outgrowth of having received that assignment from Jim. And the secret now that I'll let you in on, my go-to when I had questions would be this fellow. So I think he'll be very informative tonight. And he's talking about the Alden Villa. Also, I think an interesting fact, he used to live in the Cornwall store down in the borough center there. And so I whispered to him, gee, I ought to talk about that too. I don't think that's going to happen tonight unless you have a quick anecdote or something. But anyway, let me read the official. Jim has been researching the Coleman families and the iron industry in Lebanon County since the early 2000s. His interest started when he renovated the old Cornwall store, turning it into the Cornwall Inn. In 2022, he published the results of his research in the book, Souls of Iron. And I think most of you have heard that or seen that announcement in our literature. He currently serves as the president of the Friends of Cornwall Iron Furnace. And I would like to interject there, we just had a great open house this weekend, and a number of you took advantage of the free tour, and I would always plug the idea, why don't you come across the street and get involved with the furnace? It's a very interesting historical relic or artifact that's right here in our backyard. Very wonderful. I hope Jim says more about that too. So he's the president of the associates, which are like the auxiliary group for the furnace, the Friends, very well said. And he spent over 30 years working for various companies as a consultant specializing in intelligent automated systems. Some of his clients included Bethlehem Steel, Lucan Steel, DeFosco Steel, I hope it says that, Canada, and Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel. Jim is also an avid board game collector and player. He has written numerous articles on board games and will be publishing his first book on games, A History of Mystery and Detective Games, later this year. He lives in Cornwall with his wife, Lisa. So please welcome Jim.
Well, that made me sound pretty good. I'll have to remember that when you're available. But so yeah, I live over in Alden Place, and I know that that's the lower class retirement community in this area. So I hope you all accept me here. And I had, as Bruce said, lived in Cornwall. I bought the company store in 1999, and I was debating it. And I don't know anybody here, did you ever know Frank Dixon? Frank's no longer with us, but sitting at the Hideaway in Mount Gretna, and Frank was there, he was often there, and I said, I don't know if I should buy this place or not. And he said, where else are you going to get a bridge like that for free in your backyard? So I went ahead and did it, and it's ridiculous that the amount that I paid for it and what they're asking for it now. It's just, maybe I should have held on to it a longer period of time than I did, but that's the way it goes. really enjoyed I gutted the whole thing and then redid it, and that was a lot of fun. That's when I first discovered how wonderful Cornwall is. And I just wanted to go in and find out who owned the building, and I went into the courthouse, and then I found myself backtracking through all these deeds until I'm getting into like 1800 handwritten deeds that are written like, you know, in this hard to read scroll. And I came across the name Coleman, and I came across the thousands of acres that they owned, and I came across the name of Freeman, and I had read a lot of history, and I never really heard of these people, and I was like, why haven't I not heard of them? So that was like the genesis of why I started this book. And I thought I would focus tonight just on the Alden Villa. And I don't know how many people here have ever been inside the Alden Villa. Bruce has a couple people, so I thought maybe it might be a treat to actually see some pictures. And I took some photos in the year 2000, and then there were some photos taken for a book on Stanford White, the architect, in 2004, 2005, and there are actually some differences that are in those pictures in that brief period of time. I also have some pictures a little bit earlier than that, and then we can talk about what's going on with the Alden Villa now, because I don't know if anybody knows or not, but in December of last year, the Alden Villa, after having been available for sale for a long period of time, sold in last December, and there's a gentleman now who's working on trying to restore the building. If you have any questions along the way, you can wait till the end, you can ask me in the middle of the talk. I mean, we can just treat this very informally. But before, that is actually a picture of one of the stained glass windows. There's a bank of, it's called a fenestration. My wife pointed that out to me one time. The actual term is a fenestration, the bank of stained glass windows that are in the front, in the west side of the building as you approach it. And that is actually one of the windows. Now, before I get into the family, I actually have a unique perspective on the Alden Villa. To my knowledge, I am the only person, including well, there's two of us, my wife and myself, were the only couple to ever be married at the Alden Villa. So we got married in front of the big fireplace that I'll show you in a little while. That's just because at the time I was part of a group, a nonprofit group that was going to try to raise funds for the restoration, but that was an ill-fated, short-lived organization. There we go. So you might have been wondering, is the name Alden associated with the Mayflower Aldens? Well, the answer is yes. And the story that, I forgot to bring my Longfellow book, but the courtship of Miles Standish, which is pretty much is Longfellow, and he's a descendant of John and Priscilla, and it was mostly a fictionalized account, you know, a romanticized version of their courtship. I mean, it's funny that it's the courtship of Miles Standish, who supposedly was also originally interested in Priscilla, and then he unfortunately got killed, and John took over, and his true feelings came out. John and Priscilla were married a long time ago, and then you can see the direct line. Not all of, I mean, Marilyn Monroe was a descendant of the Aldens, and Richard Gere is a descendant of the Aldens, so lots of people. I mean, actually, if you go online, it's an amazing list of people that are descended from the John and Priscilla Alden. But what's unique here is, you'll notice the name Alden continues on through the males line for multiple generations. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So Bradford Alden, who we're going to be talking about, is the married into the Coleman, one of the Coleman daughters. His father, Roger Alden, fought in the Revolutionary War under Nathaniel Greene, part of the Connecticut Corps of the Revolutionary War. He was a graduate of Yale University, 1773. He led quite an interesting career. He also got involved with the Holland Land Company, and that took him to Meadville, Pennsylvania, where he was basically helping to sell land in what would have been the wilds of western Pennsylvania at that time. And while he was at Meadville, Bradford Ripley Alden was born in Meadville. After his father left Meadville, he took the job as quartermaster at West Point, and that's probably why Bradford Alden was a cadet at West Point. So he was a graduate of West Point. So it's very, each one of those generations, there could be a lot to be said about them. Now, as I mentioned, Bradford Alden, he was a lieutenant, and he married Robert and Ann Coleman's granddaughter, Ann Coleman, later Ann Alden. Robert Coleman, I think, is a name that probably most of us know. If you're not familiar, come on over to the furnace sometime, and we'll tell you all about Robert and Ann Coleman. But Robert Coleman came to America when he was 16 years old. He followed his brother by a year, and he had basically only 3 months' labor's wages in his pocket when he came. And he became one of the wealthiest citizens of Pennsylvania by the time he died. And the only reason I say that is because nobody really knew anybody's worth back then. It's not like there was a Forbes magazine where you could find out how much they were worth. You had to wait till somebody died and what was left in their will to know how much they were worth. And it's said that he was the first Pennsylvania millionaire on record. And there were other people that had more money at that time, but on record because he happened to pass away in 1825. They had a boatload of children, and a lot of them lived to be adults, and one of their children was Thomas Bird Coleman. That's a name we probably are familiar with. We know of Bird Coleman right in the area, even though it's not spelled the same way that his name. He was B-I-R-D, and the Bird Coleman is B-U-R-D, but, you know, mistakes are made. So they had, then Thomas Bird Coleman married Hannah Cassatt, excuse me, and who actually Hannah Cassatt's distantly related to the painter Mary Cassatt. So they had 2 sons, and they had 4 daughters, and the 2 sons are the ones that locally, Robert W. Coleman and William Coleman, they ran the iron industry in Cornwall, and Ann Alden married Bradford. It's interesting, Bradford was also an instructor at West Point, and while he was there, William Grisby Freeman was a cadet who probably might have taken a class of Bradford Alden's. He taught French and he taught military strategy. So Margaret Freeman, we know the name Freeman, right? Margaret Freeman Buckingham, right? Well, her mother married William Grisby Freeman, who was a cadet, while Bradford Alden was teaching at West Point. So these connections, I just love them. They just seem to go on forever. So this is a portrait, and these are at the Lancaster Historic Society. They're hanging on the upstairs museum part. I don't know if you've ever been to the Lancaster Historic Society. They have a big whole, the whole floor of the second floor is nothing but a museum devoted to Lebanon County, and there's a whole corner that is just devoted to the Coleman family. And these are the 2 portraits. Now Bradford, when I show you the picture of his son and his grandson, you'll see a similarity. I don't really like this picture of Anne. I think she just, this is older, this is later in her life, and I just don't think it does her justice. The one I do like is this one. And this is while she was at West Point, and this one she was a young mother, and you see the 2 children there. The children are Sarah and Robert Percy Alden, and we'll learn more about Robert Percy here shortly. And this was painted by Robert Walker Weir, and he was an art instructor at the same time that Bradford was teaching at West Point, and they became very good friends. So much so that at the end of, in Robert Percy's will, he actually left some money to his granddaughter, the painter's granddaughter, because he became friends with the painter's son, who also became a painter. So it was a close friendship, and actually Ann Alden paid for Robert Walker Weir's son to go to France to study painting. And as you can see the timeline, Bradford Alden graduated from West Point in 1831. He was an instructor there from 33 to 40, and then he was a commandeer of the cadets from 45 to 52. But then he actually went out into the field in California and Oregon and served out in the West, and there was an uprising of some Native Americans over some injustices that they felt had occurred. So he had to go out and lead a force out to quell this uprising, and he was shot in the neck. And unfortunately, he suffered from that the rest of his life. He was partially paralyzed, and it caused him intense pain he died in 1870, and so he lived that long. They did go to Europe, try to find some restoration in the Baden-Baden, those type of spas in Germany, but it never worked. What he did do in Germany was he bought a whole bunch of paintings that later on became valuable for the future generations, but he suffered a lot of pain, and he, as I said, in 1870 he passed away in Newport. So from retirement in 50, he just couldn't work anymore. He really wanted to be part of the effort in the Civil War, but his body was not going to allow him to do that. So this is on the left is Robert Percy Alden. So I don't know if I said there'd be a similarity. I mean, beyond just being bald, in terms of the facial structure, and now Robert Percy's maybe got a little bit more weight on him than Bradford did, but there's a strong resemblance there. That's his wife, Mary Ida Warren. Now the Warren family, I don't know if you've anybody ever seen Grand Central Station in New York? So that was actually co-designed by Whitney Warren. He was an architect. He submitted it to a context of design, which the Vanderbilts had the railroad. They were the ones who were putting the money up for Grand Central Station. Well, it just so happened that Mary Ida is a cousin of the Vanderbilts. So I don't know if there was any connection there, given that they gave the award to their cousin for the design of Grand Central Station, but it is quite a building. She was named Mary Ida because the family actually had a summer home in Troy, and there's Mount Ida in Troy, and so her middle name of Ida is taken from the fact that she was born in Troy, right by Mount Ida in Troy. Now her family, her father was a lawyer, he was a businessman, he owned banks, he just was very wealthy, and the Warrens were members of what was known as the 400, and the Astors in New York, and Caroline Astor, she had this big ballroom, and there was a guy that worked for her, Ward McAllister, who figured out there was only 400 families that could fit, only 400 families that could fit in this ballroom, and so it became known the 400. And if you were on that list, you were part of high society. If you weren't on that list, well, then you weren't. And unfortunately, the Colemans were not on that list, so I'm thinking that Robert Percy Alden, he kind of stepped up a little bit by marrying into the Warren family. And yet it was not a happy union, and that's the sad part. Later in the 1800s, there was some issues or problems between them. They were not getting along well, and they actually separated. Robert Percy's address was officially New York, but he made it in Pennsylvania. He changed his address so it was basically the Alden Villa, because the divorce laws in Pennsylvania were more lenient than they were in New York. And it was during this time that she was living in a hotel, Hotel Normandy in Washington, D.C. And she passed away in 1899. And the sad part is the attendant at the hotel found her in front of a mirror, and she was in flames. Now, the kind of makeup and stuff they used back then, it was very flammable. But she was just sitting at the mirror watching herself burn. She died 3 weeks later from those injuries. So it's a very tragic, very sad story. And, you know, it's just a lot of that sort of, like you got Bradford Alden, who basically is partially paralyzed his whole life. Towards the end of Robert Percy Alden's life, he was basically an invalid, living in a hotel in New York. It's said that he was still very cheerful, and he was still very kind and you know, humorous and the whole bit, but he was in pain the end of his life. So, you know, you look at the money and you look at the grandeur, and you think, oh, why they got it made, but they had their problems underneath the surface as well. I don't mean to down you or not, but this is just the story of who these people were. Now, Sarah, that's Robert Percy's older sister by 2 years. She doesn't look anything like her father. I think that she got the genes from her mother. This is a painting from 1888 by John Singer Sargent, and it's actually a painting that is at the Detroit Art Institute. So if you're in Detroit, you should go to that museum and see the painting of Sarah Alden, and her last name's Derby. Derbys were very, very wealthy. They got their money from shipping. They were from Salem, and after a few generations, they started to migrate down towards Long Island, and the fourth generation from the original Derby that made millions from shipping to China, his name was Richard Derby, and he was a medical doctor. It's actually one of the first, he has a couple distinctions. He was really the first prominent optician. He's also the first doctor to ever be sued in America for malpractice. So, you know, it's like little medical facts there. Anyhow, Sarah was in Spain. She passed away in Spain, you know, just of natural causes. A year later, her husband, though, was tormented with grief, and he committed suicide in a hotel in Connecticut. You know, more good, more happy, cheerful facts, right? This is the grandson of Bradford. Now, he's even a little bit more stout than his father. And this is John Percy Coleman Alden. So they got as much in there as they could. Pretty much he was known as Jack. Now, Jack only ever used the Alden Villa as like a summer home. He had full-time employees that kept the place running for him, and he actually had a working farm. But he was only here a few months of the year. He lived in the Brooklyn area, and just to give you an idea of the kind of place that he lived in the Brooklyn area, is you see that those are homes that are still standing there today. They were like kind of his neighbors. His home was eventually torn down. One of his neighbors purchased his home, and they used it for extending their property. But those are the kind of homes, I mean, they're not the best pictures, but they're the best I can find. That Jack passed away Christmas Eve, 1948. And he had no children, he was not married, and his brother, who was named for his grandfather, George Henry Warren Alden, had died of meningitis in 1912 in New York City. He was quite an active, vibrant person, so it was kind of sad. But Jack never married, so the end of the Alden line through this branch of the family terminated with Jack Alden here. He left the Alden Villa to his cousins, who were Sarah, his aunt's children, and there were three men, one woman that he left the Alden Villa to, with each one of them basically owning a quarter of that. They didn't really know what to do, so they decided they would auction it off. And they had had offers from, does anybody remember the name Harry Harkins from the area? Harry Harkins at one time actually ran the butcher shop at the store, and there were other local businesses that he was involved in. Anyhow, Harry Harkins was one of the people that ran the Quinton Riding Club, which is now no longer. So they wanted to purchase the Alden Villa, and they offered, I think the price was $50,000, and so that was turned down. So they had, you know, none of the offers they were getting were high enough, so they said, well, we're going to auction it. And so in 1949, it actually sold for 80, before I get to that, hold that thought. I thought this was good. These are two book plates. The one, now they were really big bibliophiles. One of the, they had, Percy Alden had like thousands of rare manuscripts, as well as a bust of Napoleon and a whole bunch of other cool things. That's, on the left, is his book plate. And you see the JAW up there in the corner. I don't know if you can read that. On the left-hand side at the top. That's for Julian Alden Weir. I mentioned about the portrait of Anne Alden with her children was painted by Weir. Well, his son, Julian Alden Weir, that's how close they were. They named, his father named him with the middle name Alden. That's how close the family was. So he actually designed, and he's a famous American Impressionist painter. If you go and look up Julian Alden Weir, he's got a lot of very, considered very important American Impressionistic paintings. But he did the book plate for Robert Percy Alden, that's JAW. Now, Jack has the one on the right, and does that boat make you think of anything? Does it harken back to the Plymouth Heritage, the Mayflower? Yeah. So that was, obviously, I take this, and I'm making this up, is that he took great pride in his lineage. And he didn't put an iron furnace up there for the Coleman side. He put a boat up there for the Alden side. I don't know if that means anything. We're going to get back to I was starting to go down the wrong track. We're going to get back to the sale of the auction. I got ahead of myself, I apologize. But we're going to talk about the architects of the Alden Villa. So here we have, and have you heard of McKim, Mead and White? If you haven't, they were like the big architectural firm in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And actually, there are people that actually consider Stanford White America's most significant architect, other than Frank Lloyd Wright. And that's probably a name you've heard of, maybe, is Frank Lloyd Wright. Following water. Charles Follen McKim, William Rutherford Mead, and they formed a partnership with a man named Bigelow, William Bigelow. Bigelow, that's William, it's not William. Anyhow, they formed it in 1877. And the partnership dissolved, and in 1779, they brought Stanford White in, who was young, as their third partner. The reason why McKim, Mead, and Bigelow failed is because Charles Follen McKim got a divorce. His wife left him at the time. Her maiden name was Bigelow. Bigelow was her brother, so it made for uncomfortable partnership. So McKim, Mead, and Bigelow was no more. They wanted a third partner, and they wanted somebody with creative ideas, and they found Stanford White, who at the time was young and just starting out, and he had tremendous ideas, and we're going to see a little bit of what he thought of. This is Fort Hill. The reason why I mention this is because this was, Anne Alden had this built. Charles Follen McKim was the primary architect behind designing this, and it was in 1779. It's built on the base. The reason why it's called Fort Hill is that during the Revolutionary War, the British built a fort there to be able to see ships and stuff like that, because the vantage point of Long Island Sound is amazing. And the fort was torn down, but they bought the property, and I have a view of what it looks like today. But the Derby, I mentioned that Sarah Alden married Richard Derby. Well, he was the landlord for Charles Fulton McKim in New York City. So there was like a connection there. Charles Fulton McKim got the job to design Anne Alden's home up on Fort Hill. She owned it until she died in 1896. And at that point it became Sarah and Dr. Derby's property. This is some shots from today, from when it sold at auction a few years ago for like, I don't know, 10 million or something like that. The facade, the outside was completely redone. It didn't have the stick style architecture, but they bricked the front, but the inside would have looked like that one building in the top left, the room on the top left. And the bottom part, the bottom picture is actually still what was designed. It's original. The view would have been the view. That's Long Island Sound that it looks out on. It's really quite amazing. My wife and I were on vacation. We went to Sagamore, which was Teddy Roosevelt's home, and we went to see a couple other buildings. And I wanted to see Fort Hill, but there's private property signs like every 100 yards. And so I just kept driving and she kept getting nervous. It's like, we can't do this, we can't do this. And I even got out of the car when I got in front and I was going to walk up and take a picture, but they have a dog about this big. So I changed my mind about that, but I've taken her on. I've trespassed with her many times and she's never been comfortable with that. All in the name of history, right? These are some buildings that that primarily were Stanford White's designs. The one on the top left is called Namkeg, and there was a very wealthy lawyer and ambassador to England at one time, Joseph Coates. That's the backyard showing his mansion. The one on the top right is the inside courtyard of the Newport Casino. And Stanford White and McKim, Mead and White did a lot of buildings in Newport. The bottom left is the outside view looking at the ocean of Rosecliff, which was built for the Ulrich family. Ulrich, you might not know that name, but he was one of 4 partners that discovered the Comstock lode. You might know that name. Made a lot of people very wealthy. And the bottom right, and by the way, you can tour all of those. Except for the Villard Mansion, you can't necessarily tour, but if you have the right friends, you might be invited to a party there. It's right down from Rockefeller Center, a couple blocks. If you walk down Rockefeller Center, that's the view you'll get of the Villard Mansion. He had this built, and then less than a year later, he lost his money. So it was supposed to be 4 different families would reside in that. So now let's talk a little bit more about the villa. The Alden Villa kind of languished in architectural publications for a long time. A gentleman by the name of J. Cornelius Peck took an interest in the Alden Villa and came up and did a number of sketches. This is one sketch. And he wrote a book about the Alden Villa. It was the first time that anybody really took an interest to publish something, specifically a book on the Alden Villa. That's his sketch. And that was actually borrowed without permission on our wedding invitations. So I hope he doesn't mind. Oh, did it again. This is about 1900. Now you can't see the windows, but you can at least see that the top 2 banks of 4 windows, those are all stained glass, and the 2 below that are stained glass, but the very bottom 2 windows are clear. That would have been what you would have seen as you approached the mansion from the left about 1900. Notice on the back, there's just an open little porch there. When I show you a couple pictures in a little bit, you'll see that it's different. They added a library later on onto the property. This is the rear of the building. Just kind of gives you an idea of the brick. and the stone and the shingle style. That they called this style Beaux-Art, and it was very popular among Stanford White's early buildings. But then, if you remember, I just showed you Rosecliff and Villard. Those are like more neoclassical or Renaissance revival. As they developed their practice through the years, they stopped building buildings like this.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
It's not local. Where is this building?
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. So, do you know where the Quentin Riding Club was?
Yeah.
So right before you get to the Quentin Riding Club, there's Alden Place. And you turn left, and it's called Alden Way. And you go up a little hill, there's like a little gatehouse. To the right was where where the Alden Villa sits.
Okay.
When it's winter time, and you look from the road up on the hill to the left, you can see it. Right now with the trees, you can't see it right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, my apologies. I like this view. This is from the 1930s. And this is when R. Percy Alden is no longer living, and Jack has the place, but he only visits a few months of the year. But look how good and how, I mean, you can imagine this was a Better Homes and Garden or something like that. I mean, it's just it's a great picture. It shows what it looked like, and you know, you can appreciate its beauty just by looking at it. That little curve there, that tall curve, there's actually a stone seat that is built into the wall right there. So I mentioned I'd get back to the auction. It went in the York paper, went in the Harrisburg paper, the Lancaster paper. They wanted to sell off the land separately from the mansion. That never happened. They were able to dispose of some of the farm animals and some of the farm equipment separately, but the land basically, came intact at the auction. The original 207 acres were purchased by Anne Alden for the purpose that was going to be where her son was going to have a mansion built. She purchased the land from R.W. Coleman heirs, which was the structure set up after her brother passed away. Anne Alden's brother passed away, who basically ran the furnaces, R.W. Coleman. William, the other brother, had died in 1861. So this was a long time later. R. Percy, as I mentioned, died in 1870, so Anne lived a lot longer than he did, 26 years after he died. But she lived in Fort Hill. So what she did is she moved out of, just a few years after living at Fort Hill, big house, and she bought a house right down the road that was more like a farmhouse, very primitive. The floors weren't even, they kind of sloped, they had slate floors, you could still see the old kitchen, and it was primitive in terms of compared to what she had at Fort Hill. And she put her daughter in at Fort Hill, and Richard Derby, they moved into Fort Hill. So I don't know, to even things out, she had Alden Villa built for Robert Percy and his new bride, Mary Ida Warden, Warden Alden. So Anne still owned Alden Villa and Fort Hill until she died. R. Percy Alden didn't actually own Alden Villa until after his mother passed away, and in her will, she left the home to him. So the mansion was completed in 1881. I'll show you on a couple of the stained glass windows. They actually put 1881 on the windows, and when the plasterers were working on the dining room area, they wrote Garfield dead, and they put the date, 1881, Garfield died. So the plaster was up by the time Garfield died. And so it went to auction, and it was bought by Mrs. D.J. Monas and her husband David of Pennsylvania for $88,000. And they had the dream to, and they were organizers and principals of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. And they had the vision of having a retreat center for the union members, so that they could just come and relax and stay there, and they'd have, they had a big swimming pool they built, and they had talks, and it was just kind of a place to rejuvenate for the union members. It took them until 1955 to open, and there was an article, and I cover all this in my book, by the way, including the following. I mean, there's a quote that was in the New York Times, and they talk about how ironic it was that this home that basically was the home of one person and never more than 4 was now going to be a facility for thousands. And they just found that ironic when the New York Times reported on this. The actual long quote is really worth reading. And I think you can just Google it too and get it. The Union Center, they had it. It started to be hard for them to maintain it. So in 1983, they sold the property. There was a pastor from the Midwest that had an idea that he wanted to build a religious retreat on the property. He could never get his funding together, and it switched hands a couple of times. And then finally, it sold, and Alden Place was built. And what the owners of Alden Place, what they decided to do was to section off the barn and the mansion, and they actually had to move the barn over towards where the mansion is, and they would sell that separately, and then they sell that locally. They sold that locally to Ed Arnold and a minor partner, Kip Kelly, who's an architect. And then they started the restoration work, and that was back in the early 2000s. And that partnership dissolved, and it just, and those of you that might have known this and may not, it just sat empty for years and years now. The roof was falling apart, there was damage inside, all the way down to the basement. It was just, it was falling apart, and it didn't have that many more years left in it. And now, in last December, as I mentioned, Harvey Turner has purchased the property. He's put a new roof on it. He's going to do the work. He sold everything he had to buy it, and he's not sure how far he's going to get, but he's just 100% committed to put everything he has into the restoration. This is what it would have looked like when I first saw it, and it pretty much does look like that today. It's a little different look than what I showed you in the other picture, but it's the same view. And I mentioned that they put an addition on the back side that you can see there's still a little bit of an open porch, but that white part that you can see in between the darker areas, that's a library that they put in to house this, what was an incredible collection of books. They also put a men's smoking room. There's a door through the one bookshelf area. It's kind of like a hidden door, but if you open it up, you go down these steps, and it was a men's smoking room. Anyhow, so when you walk to the front of the house, the porte cochere there with the stripes, they are not the original stripes now. They are more like a vinyl type of siding on it. But I point out the starburst. That's actually on the side of the outside wall. It is like a pebble dash kind of wall. It's actually a signature thing that Stanford White would do on his buildings in the early days of his building. It's in their like bottle cap bottoms. And it's said that he actually put them in himself. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it's said that. So when that's the original doors with the original hinges. There's a dolphin knocker on the door, and it's a Dutch door. So it can be opened up, just halfway like a Dutch door. You walk through that door, and you walk into the middle photo. It shows like a vestibule. So as soon as you walk through the front door, if you look over to the right, you're going to see this big display of windows. look, you know, and it has a huge big barrel ceiling. It's inside the foyer itself. It's like, you know, I don't know, maybe just a little taller than that. It's not big, but you go into this building and it's kind of on the small, constrained side. But as soon as you walk towards the ballroom, it's just this huge, big, open expanse. It's really quite an incredible feeling to see it. The ceiling at the top there that's the design that is still there today. The thing that is not there, and you might not be able to tell this, but you see the light that in the middle picture? It's actually, it was a hand-blown glass from France, and you see no cracks in it. It's at this point in time in 2000, it's not broken, but I'm going to show you a couple sad things in a minute. Before we do that, you know, see the chip on the side of the glass there? I don't know if you can tell, but the yellow greenish glass that's hanging down, it's actually broken on the one side. During the time when it was sitting empty, vandals got inside. They did a lot of damage. One of the damages was that they broke that light. That light was hand-blown in France in the 1800s, and, you know, with materials that, you know, are really not duplicated that easily today. I don't know what Harvey's going to do about that, but that is unfortunate. And there was a lot of other damage I'll show you in a minute, but I want you to take a look at the wood. This is indicative of Stanford White's early work, the warm feeling that he tried to convey with wood, and the way he would sculpt the wood to give you certain kind of image. You see the reflections of the light on the wall there, and almost this is all well thought out in Stanford White's mind, and the little, it's almost like on a ship. I don't know for certain, but it's almost like that was there as a hearkening back to the Mayflower. I made that up. I don't know if that's true. But usually everything Stanford White did, he did with his clients in mind. So it almost would make sense to me if that were intentional. Now, the shot on the left is like from 2005. You see in the very center, you see the square. That same square is on the right side, has a wooden woven center with the circle in it. That circle's not up there. And as well as some of these panels that you can see in the picture on the right, which is from 2000, the other picture's from 2005, there's some of the panels that are broken. That entire centerpiece was broken out by vandals. It's, you know, unfortunate. And this is the fireplace. It's going up like 2.5 stories. It's got a glass-fired brick, a glass-fired front in the fireplace area, and it just extends all the way up with the barrel ceiling, and you got these windows. It's very grand. And what I showed you in the previous picture, they would have had musicians up on the top here playing, and they would have had dancing down below, down here. And the windows are all individually different from one another. They have a lot of pastoral type scenes in them, and flowers and floral pictures. And in the middle row, that is the second lower with the 4 panels, is the date in Roman numerals 1881. This is just off of the ballroom. There's a little office area, and there's a little fireplace. There's 2 seats there that have granite on them, and you see the wood carvings above. It's very indicative of Stanford White style from this time period. It's not a very good photo, but that's the library that was added on the addition. They have this nice curved seat. This room is probably, from me to that wall, 2 sides filled with bookshelves. Now, when I went in the building, those books were gone. and I think those books were gone when the Union Center got it. But there were a lot of books on unions that were in their library when I went into it that apparently were there since the 80s. So you come in, you have the entryway. Instead of going to the ballroom area, you go around the corner a little bit. That would be, you'd see the back breakfast room. That is a built-in buffet, and on the top left, on the bottom left is a place that you can tour in Newport called Kingscote. Stanford White redid their dining area for them. That was the assignment he had just before Alden Villa, which was his first single home assignment. And that's the built-in buffet at Kingscote that you can go and tour today. It's a little different, but you can see similar elements in it. On the top right, each one of the panels, and you might not be able to tell, but you see how on the one side of the top left it kind of slants? Each one of the 4 panels on the buffet have a tool design that is unique to each one of the doors. The bottom right photo is the fireplace that's in the breakfast room. And I say that breakfast room, they also had a dining room, but this would have been the breakfast room with the fireplace going, that nice buffet, and then above, you can't really maybe tell very much, but this is a woven wicker ceiling. And there were a few more of them built. To my knowledge, this is the only woven wicker ceiling extant still in the United States. And it's really quite unique. The picture doesn't even come close to doing it justice. And this is a little close-up of the carved detail. This is the steps that lead from the first floor up to the second floor, but the ornate carving. This bank of windows here on the right, there's 6 windows, that's what you see as you ascend the steps up to the second floor. And you can see them from the outside as well. They are not as ornate as the windows that are in the ballroom, and I think that would have been intentional, but it's very relaxing with the way the light comes in from these stained glass. This is not the Alden Villa, but I wanted to show you a couple examples of buildings that Stanford White did at the same time. The one on the left is another one from Newport that you can, I told you Stanford White did a lot of work in Newport. This is from, the one on the left is from the Isaac Bell House, and it's the same kind of effect. As you're ascending the stairs at the Isaac Bell House, there's these, really nice stained glass that would be, lighting your way as you went up. And the one on the right, you can go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they actually have a Stanford White, McKim White area at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this, they took out of a home that Stanford White had designed that was from Buffalo. So they took it out of a mansion in Buffalo that was going to be demolished, and it's installed now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is upstairs, and the room on the left was Mary Ida's bedroom. Her and Percy Hall had separate bedrooms, but that was very common back then. I know I told you about their problems earlier, but it was very common that these wealthy Gilded Age couples had separate bedrooms, but that was her bedroom. And then I wanted to give you a contrast. This is the servants' steps that they would have taken. It's not quite as ornate as what the steps were for guests and family, but still it's very substantial. And the whole third floor had servants' quarters. So 1936, if you would have been driving down by where the tennis courts are by the Methodist Church, you would have seen that, see that stone pillar right there? That was actually part of the entry gates, one of the entry gates for Alden Place. Those got auctioned off in like the 60s, and then they got sold to somebody else, who then sold them to somebody else, and we have a volunteer on our board at the furnace, Irv Muritz, who actually tracked down where they are, and he found these. It's like it's only about 8 or 10 miles from here, heading east. He found them, somebody bought them, and those are the original gates that were at Alden Place, so they're being well cared for today. And I mentioned they had to move the barn, so if you were familiar with going up towards Alden Place where the gatehouse is on Alden Way, you look to the left, you don't see anything but trees there. That's where the barn was, and that's the shape that the barn was in. Now, it's a different angle from that photo to this is what it is today. Now, it was shops, but it no longer is shops. I don't know what's going to happen to it, but Harvey Turner did not purchase this building. He only purchased the mansion, so this is still, who knows what's going to happen to it, but it was restored back in like the 2005, 2008, 10, that frame of time. I mentioned then the one on the bottom left, that was actually a home that one of the workers would have lived in. This was also designed by Stanford White, and there were a couple of them, but when Alden Place got built, they tore down these homes. Now you see the, it's called an eyebrow on the roof. I don't know if you can tell that there's a window. If you look at the slant of the left side of the building, there's like a curve. That was a window. It's called an eyebrow window, and they're actually kind of rare in architecture. And I point out the one on the right, the Union Center added these big stone grill type things, and they had a whole bunch of them down there right off of Alden Way. The Alden Way Clubhouse is right here. These would have been in the field, in the flat there, and so the members would all be able to, like, you know, grill or, you know, whatever, hopefully had s'mores at these. Those are gone now too, though. That's my talk. Thank you. Any questions?
Has that lake there at the clubhouse always been there?
There was actually a swimming pool there, a small one, when Jack Alden had it. The union group tore that out. They built this huge swimming pool. They basically tore that out, and then they put in the pond. Not the Union Center, but basically the pond exists the way Louis Hurst kind of, you know, brought it to what it is today.
Who put the pond in?
Basically, Louis Hurst made the pond the way it looks today. But there had been this huge swimming pool there that the Union Center put in. Well, if there are no other questions, just to let you know, I do have some of my books with me. If you want a book, you can purchase one in the back. It's $34.95 plus tax. And also the Iron Furnace sells them. And I have a website, which is, maybe you're going to like this, www.before, all one word, I'm through. I am, before I'm through. So hopefully we can appreciate that we might have something we want to do before we're through. So I got all these projects I want to do. And how you can go there and you can purchase one there if you want. I have e-books and paperback versions. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate you paying attention to me, at least looking like you were interested. So thank you.
Thank you.